2 American soldiers dead, just from the cold. 5 wounded in the fight itself.
Wow.
Then you look at the Hessians, 22 killed, 83 wounded, and almost 900 captured.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You know, those numbers tell you a lot about just how decisive this battle was.
They really do, yeah.
The Battle of Trenton, December 26, 1776, is a fascinating one.
Absolutely.
We've got firsthand accounts, battle maps, all sorts of stuff to dig into today.
Yeah, and I think it's easy when you just glance at it to think, okay, another battle.
Right.
But to get why it's so important, you really got to step back and look at the big picture. The Continental Army was, well, let's be honest, they were getting hammered.
Oh, yeah.
You know, defeats in New York, that awful retreat across New Jersey.
Morale was non-existent.
Washington himself, he's writing, I think the game is pretty near up. I mean,
Right.
That's bleak.
It was. The revolution was on the verge of collapse. People were deserting left and right. They thought it was over.
So that's what we're really going to try to figure out today. How did this battle, not a huge one in terms of numbers, how did it inject this energy back into the revolution?
Right. How did it become this turning point when everything looked so hopeless?
Exactly.
It's a great question.
So, all right, here we are facing this, awful situation. And Washington comes up with this plan, and it is wild.
It's incredible.
Crossing the Delaware, Christmas night, ice everywhere, to attack a Hessian garrison at Trenton. You couldn't make this stuff up.
You really couldn't. And, the sources really emphasize how much of a gamble it was. It was winter. The conditions were brutal.
The river itself is dangerous, even without ice.
Right. Just getting across was a huge risk,
Right.
let alone a surprise attack.
And to make things even worse, they couldn't even stick to the original plan. They were supposed to have 3 detachments converge on Trenton.
Right.
But 2 of them, Cadwallader and Ewing, they couldn't get across the river at all. The weather was just too bad.
Yeah. So instead of 7,400 men, Washington's down to about 2,400, less than half.
Right.
And the crossing itself, it was a nightmare. Rain, sleet, snow, the whole works. They used these boats called Durham boats.
I've seen pictures, yeah.
Flat-bottomed, perfect for shallow water and tough conditions. Really reliable. And these guys, John Glover's 14th Continental Regiment, they were the ones rowing them. Imagine that. Men, horses, artillery, all packed into these boats in that weather with ice in the water.
And their password was victory or death.
I mean, talk about setting the tone.
Seriously. It wasn't just the fighting that was dangerous, though. I mean, 2 guys died just from the cold during the march after the crossing.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that part, how harsh those conditions were.
Yeah.
But there's this other aspect, too, the intelligence and deception side of things. It wasn't just about brute force.
Oh, right. The spy stuff.
Exactly. You have John Honeyman, this guy pretending to be a Tory. He somehow gets the Hessians to trust him completely.
And he's feeding them all this bad info, telling them the Americans are too demoralized to attack.
Right. And it's interesting because Honeyman, he'd actually served with the British during the French and Indian War.
Oh, wow.
So he knew how they operated, knew how to blend in. He was a butcher and a bartender, too.
Perfect cover.
Right. Talking to soldiers all the time, listening, planting these seeds of doubt. And then, to make it even more convincing, he gets captured by the Americans, has this meeting with Washington, then escapes.
Like a scene from a movie.
It's incredible.
But then there's this other guy, right? Abraham Hunt, a loyalist. He hosts the Hessian commander, Colonel Rall, for a Christmas dinner.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about bad timing.
Unintentionally, he creates this atmosphere of complete safety right before the attack.
Yeah, he must felt awful afterwards.
I bet. But that leads to the question, why were the Hessians so unprepared? I mean, how did they miss all the warning signs?
Well, from what I understand, they really thought Trenton was safe, no patrols going out very far.
Yeah. And that terrible weather on Christmas night, it meant they couldn't even do their usual shorter patrols.
So they were blind.
Essentially. And then you have Colonel Rall. He's this interesting figure. Publicly, he's super confident, almost dismissive. Famous quote, "Let them come, we will go at them with the bayonet."
Yeah, you can't help but think famous last words.
Right. But his letters, they tell a different story. He was actually pretty worried. He even asked for British troops to be stationed nearby, which shows he wasn't so sure after all.
So he was putting on a brave face.
And crucially, he ignored the advice of his own engineers. They'd suggested fortifying Trenton, even had plans for a redoubt, a little defensive fort, at a key intersection. But he didn't listen.
So this overconfidence had ended up costing him.
A big lesson there, right? Even if you're feeling uneasy, you can't ignore those doubts, especially when you're up against a determined enemy.
So let's get into the attack itself.
Right.
We know the plan to attack from three sides didn't work out because of the weather. What was it supposed to look like?
Okay, so the original idea was pretty complex. You have Cadwallader creating a diversion down south in Bordentown to keep the British busy. Then Ewing was supposed to cross at Trenton Ferry and capture the bridge over the Assunpink Creek.
So they trapped the Hessians?
Right, no escape route south. And then Washington, with the main force, would hit Trenton from the north. Two wings, led by Greene and Sullivan.
But with Cadwallader and Ewing out of the picture, it all falls on Washington's shoulders.
Yeah, and they had to march 9 miles to get to Trenton in the middle of the night after that horrible river crossing.
That's hard to even imagine.
I know. A lot of the soldiers didn't even have proper boots. They were wrapping rags around their feet because they were bleeding so badly.
Awful.
There are accounts saying the snow was stained red with their blood, but they kept going.
Wow.
Luckily, they had local volunteers acting as guides.
So they knew the area.
Right. And Washington, he's riding up and down the line, encouraging his men. At one point, he even tells Sullivan, if the gunpowder gets wet, use the bayonet. That's how determined he was.
No retreat.
None at all. Then, just outside of Trenton, they run into this Hessian outpost at a cooper shop on Pennington Road. That's where things get real. Bad. The Hessian commander, Lieutenant Wiederholt, he sees the Americans coming and shouts, "Der Feind! The enemy! Shots are fired. It's on."
That must have been a shock for the Hessians.
Oh, yeah. But Washington, he was ready for this. He'd already sent some riflemen and some German-speaking soldiers to block the road at Princeton.
Smart. So the Hessians couldn't call for reinforcements or escape that way?
Exactly. So Wiederholt, he realizes this is a serious attack, not just a small raid, and orders his men to retreat back to Trenton.
And then the Americans enter the town, Greene from the north, Sullivan from the south.
And this is where their artillery really comes into play.
Yeah, I was looking at the battle maps earlier. The American cannons, they were placed right at the top of King and Queen streets.
Perfect positions.
Yeah.
And you know what's ironic? That's exactly where the Hessian engineers had suggested building a redoubt, a defensive fort.
Oh.
But Rao, remember, he ignored that advice.
Mm.
So now the American artillery has a clear shot right into the town.
It's like they set themselves up for this.
Pretty much. And Sullivan, after making sure Greene was engaging the enemy up north, he focuses on a building called the Hermitage.
Where was that?
It was on the outskirts of town. Some Hessian light infantry, Jaegers, were stationed there. They're quickly scattered, though.
So the Hessians are totally caught off guard. They're trying to organize a defense, right? I read about these three regiments, Rauls, Lossbergs, and Knyphausen's. They're trying to counterattack.
Yeah, but it's too late. They're getting hit hard by the American cannons and muskets. Rahl himself, he leads a charge to try to silence those cannons. But it's a disaster. They can't hold a formation. Grape shot and musket fire were just tearing them apart. General Mercer, he'd positioned his men in houses.
So they had cover.
Right. And the Hessian artillery, it's quickly destroyed or captured. Down on Queen Street, it's the same story. More Hessian attacks, more failures. The Americans are just too strong.
It's falling apart for the Hessians.
Yeah. They try to retreat to a field outside town, but they're still getting hammered by cannon fire.
Couldn't catch a break.
No. And meanwhile, Sullivan, he's making real progress in the South. Colonel John Stark, he leads this incredible bayonet charge against the Knyphausen regiment. Apparently, a lot of their muskets weren't even firing because of the rain.
Oh, so they were sitting ducks.
Basically. And Sullivan, he's smart. He then moves his troops to block the bridge over the Assunpink Creek. So now there's no escape route south for the Hessians.
Trapped.
Completely. Then Rahl, he tries one last desperate gamble. He rallies his men, the band's playing, trying to get their spirits up. They charge towards the American flank, but they're hit from three sides. It's a massacre. They even manage to recapture some cannons for a moment, but the Americans take them right back. And during this whole mess, Rahl is fatally wounded.
The end for him.
It was. His men, they just scatter. The remaining Hessians, they retreat into an orchard, but they're completely surrounded. They have no choice but to surrender. And even the Knyphausen regiment, they tried to escape across the bridge, but ran straight into Sullivan's men.
So it's over.
Yeah. The Hessians are completely defeated, and the casualties, they really tell the story. 22 Hessians killed, 83 wounded, and between 800 and 900 captured.
And Rahl and all four of their colonels in Trenton, they were either killed or captured.
A total rout. And the Americans, they captured tons of supplies, weapons, ammunition, stuff they desperately needed.
It's amazing how few casualties they had. Just 5 wounded in the battle. Of course, the 2 guys who died from the cold, that's a tragedy too.
It is. And it's worth mentioning, James Monroe, the future president, he was actually wounded in the fighting.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay, so there's this whole thing about the Hessians being drunk during the battle, that it was basically a Christmas party gone wrong.
Ah, yeah, that's a popular story. But historians have looked into it, and it's just not true. Yeah. Guys like David Hackett Fisher, Edward Lengel, they've studied the first-hand accounts, and there's no evidence of any drinking that night.
So what's the real story then?
It's much simpler. The Hessians were just tired. They'd been on alert for weeks. The weather was awful. They were exhausted. No need to add drunkenness to the mix.
The victory, Washington says, this is a glorious day for our country.
It was a huge morale boost for sure. Washington, he even interviews Lieutenant Wiederholt after the battle to figure out what went wrong for the Hessians. And even though Cadwalader and Ewing didn't make it across the river, the victory itself was enough. It showed the Continental Congress that they could win.
It proved they could beat the British and the Hessians.
Right. And tons of soldiers re-enlisted. The revolution had a pulse again. And that fear of the Hessians, it pretty much vanished after Trenton. Even the British were shocked. General Howe, he couldn't believe it.
And this victory, it wasn't just a one-off. It had real long-term consequences. It's often compared to the Battle of Cowpens.
Exactly. Trenton became this symbol of American resilience, of their ability to overcome the odds. And it set the stage for more victories, like the battles of Assunpink Creek and Princeton, which happened right after.
So it really was a turning point.
No doubt about it. And even today, we see the legacy of Trenton. The monument, the reenactments, even some units in the National Guard and the regular Army trace their lineage back to the soldiers who fought there.
And of course, we can't forget that painting.
Washington crossing the Delaware.
It's so iconic.
Yeah, painted by Emanuel Luzzi in 1851. It became a sensation immediately, both in the U.S. and in Europe.
It's amazing how it captures the moment.
Right. Luzzi, he was German himself, and he hoped the painting would inspire revolutions back home.
Wow.
Today, it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the most famous American paintings ever.
So to wrap this up, it's clear that Trenton, it wasn't just another battle. It was a moment that changed everything. It gave the Americans hope when they desperately needed it, and it shows how Washington, with his daring plan and his ability to take advantage of the situation, he could pull off the seemingly impossible.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what if the Americans had lost at Trenton? What would have happened to the revolution?
Scary thought.
It was a fragile time. A defeat could have been devastating.
So if you want to learn more about Trenton, I'd suggest checking out some biographies of the key players. Washington, Raoul, even the spy, Honeyman. Their stories are fascinating.
Or you could read up on the New York and New Jersey campaign of 1776. It gives you a sense of the bigger picture of just how important this battle was.
Great suggestions.
This was fun.
It really was. Until next time.
See